I'm Jeremy Till, and this is Amplify. Joah, our next guest, founder of Local Lore. Exciting to hear his story of processing as a millennial in the marketplace, has had his hand in a share of different jobs and opportunities here in the Austin market, also being out in Washington, and now going through 4 phases that he describes his startup, Local Lore, in fundraising money and getting them where they are today in the maturing status of the company. So looking forward to hearing his message. Mr. Joah, you know, where's your name from?
Yeah, so I have 2 older brothers, and my oldest brother's name is Karan, and it sounds like the Quran, but it's actually spelled Kahron. He's a writer for the Austin Chronicle here in Austin, and then my middle brother, his name is Ramiah, so it's Ramiah, and so very interesting names that have this kind of like religious, biblical sound. And I think that was just the thing that my mom and my dad were trying to accomplish. And so I think that the way I was told was that my mom knew that she wanted my name to start with a J. And I don't know if it was subconscious, because I don't think that she knew that it was a biblical name, but they named me Joah. And I don't have a middle name. So I stand alone on my first name. It needs to have some value, right? And it's in the Bible. It's in a couple different parts of the Bible. It's in 2 Kings primarily, and it means keeper of messages. And it's basically this guy who would take messages to the king of Syria, eons ago, and he was this trusted message keeper. And so for me, I translate that to that's what I am. I'm a communicator. I find ways to distill information and then to disseminate that information. And I've done that with almost everything that I've done entrepreneurially has been with that. So it's kind of a fitting name. Nice. So that's where my name comes from.
That's cool. So where did you grow up?
I was born in Temple, Texas. So my dad was in the Army. In Fort Hood. Mm-hmm. And so I was born in Temple, then we lived in Killeen until I was about 6. My parents divorced when I was 2.5, 3 years old. And then when I was 6, my mom kind of picked up my 2 older brothers and I, and we moved to South Carolina because her mother had moved there 10 years prior. And so we didn't have any other than my grandmother. We didn't have a bunch of family there and stuff. Most of my family is from East Texas, Nacogdoches and Lufkin. But we moved to upstate South Carolina. We lived in a small town called Anderson, close to where Clemson University is. Okay. And then we moved to Greenville, South Carolina, which is kind of like the metro area of South Carolina that is in Charleston. So there's a big BMW facility there. There's a big Michelin plant. So we moved there. So from age 8 through 16, I lived in Greenville, South Carolina. Grew up in this small town. I rode the bus to middle school, walked to elementary school, walked to high school, and we grew up poor. I mean, we in South Carolina, when we first moved to South Carolina, we were definitely in Section 8 housing, and my mom worked 2-3 jobs, we survived on food stamps. Some of my earliest memories as a child are of being without means. I mean, when I was 10 years old, I vividly remember going to the grocery store with my mom and being at the checkout at the register, scanning items, and then my mom asking me to take 2 or 3 things back because we didn't have enough food stamps to cover the cost. And at that moment, one of my classmates was in the register next to us with his mom. And I was like, that's the last time and the only time I've ever felt true embarrassment. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't embarrassment at no point did I ever blame my mom. I was never upset with her because I always saw her working 2-3 jobs, working really hard. It was just it made me cognizant of the fact of I was not a have, I was definitely a have not. And so from that moment on, I decided that I was going to try to create my own business, my own value, whatever. So the next year I started, my first business was cutting grass for my neighbors. And then the next year, I realized I couldn't cut grass while I was in school, so I started selling candy and bubble gum to my classmates. And I was, making $500-$600 a month in middle school, doing with my first little cash flow positive businesses, so that I could pay for school clothes and like field trips and stuff like that. So that kind of got me on that entrepreneurial journey.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. Now, I'll tell you that you were about 6 years ahead of me, but the same journey I started was the lawn salon with one of my buddies. We did lawn mowing service in the summers. Yeah. And then I transitioned to, cinnamon buns and lollipops. So my mom would go to Sam's and I would get buy all that up and sell it to my classmates.
Buy it in bulk. That's the same thing I did with the gum. Yep. Buy the 4-pack for $1 and then break it apart and then sell each pack for $1 or each piece for $0.25. That's what I did. So
that's great. So going through junior high, high school, was university, was school, was your deal, or were you sports? What was all that like?
Yeah. So, because being cognizant of knowing that my family was poor, knowing that no one in my family had graduated from college, that was something I knew from a very early age, even before I was 10-11 years old. And I remember one day when I think I was in 4th grade, I told my mom that I was going to go to college, and she was like, "That's great," but she was very clear, but you have to figure out a way to pay for it. Mm-hmm. It was always, that was a real thing. And so in middle school, I pretty much, there was a computer. We didn't have a computer at home, but we had one at our school in the library. So they had 3 computers, these old Microsoft DOS, whatever machines. And there was a computer in school called SCOIS. So we had a program called SCOIS, and SCOIS was South Carolina Occupational Information Services. And it was like this software thing where you fill out a questionnaire, it's like 20 or 30 questions, and then it spits out likelihood of different professions that you should do. And number 1 for me was always businessman, or like CEO. It always said that. And so I was like, maybe I should be a businessman. And I was starting to read about these stories about people who were in business. And I was like, what is that? My mom she was the assistant for a guy who franchised like a dozen or 2 dozen Pizza Huts in upstate South Carolina. So I knew he was the only black person I knew that owned his own business. And he went to our church, and I saw him once after church. We went to brunch, and I remember there were like 30 of us that he took out for, to eat after church. And he like put his credit card down without even looking at the receipt. And I just remember thinking that was just like so amazing that like someone could do that, because we never even ate out. Mm-hmm. And I just was like, man, I want to be a business person. And so I took this SCOIS test. And then the cool thing that it did is it didn't just say, hey, you have a 97% match to be in business. It then had a different thing that showed you colleges that offered the degrees that would help you get that profession. And so I started looking at like business schools, and UT has one of the best business schools. So that's how I learned about UT. So since I was like 12, I wanted to go to UT, even when I was living in South Carolina. And so I made this plan. I looked up different colleges like North Carolina, Michigan, Texas, UVA, and I looked up their admissions policies when I was like 12 years old to see like who gets in those schools. I looked at like their average SAT scores, average GPAs, all this stuff. And so I made this plan. I wrote it down and was like, when I graduate from high school, I want to be able to say that I did all these things. Like they have to accept me. And so that's what I did. I was like, I was the Beta Club kid. I was the National Honor Society kid. I was like the straight A student. But I was also like in the marching band. I played baritone in the band. I ran track and cross country. Like I was in all the clubs and stuff. And so when I graduated from high school, we ended up moving back to Texas my junior year of high school, and I got automatic admissions to Texas. So it worked out that we moved back and I went to UT. And then the whole paying for it piece was like the hard part. And what I did is, I applied for over 100 scholarships my senior year of high school, and I won like 2 dozen of them. And that was how I paid for college. Every day of my senior year of high school, I would do a different essay for a different scholarship. And it got to a point where the guidance counselor at the high school knew how hard I was working for scholarships, that she was applying to scholarships for me. And I ended up winning like a couple of small scholarships because like they were like, this kid works really hard and he's like qualified to win this scholarship. And like I won like 2 or 3 scholarships I didn't even myself apply for.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many laws that you're just describing that you are putting into motion through your natural desire and hunger to, achieve a goal. Are you familiar with Think and Grow Rich?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's really, I've been, Rob Dyrdek has popped up on a few podcasts just recently, and he's kind of re-engineered his life. An influence on him was Tony Robbins, and he had read the Think and Grow Rich, but he really, what I love in his last podcast with Lewis House, he did another one with one of his friends, and he really talks about, goals being seeable, achievable and believable, seeable, achievable, but with a clear plan.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a believable plan to execute where you want to go, the likelihood of you getting there is almost impossible. Yep. And so, and
I was talking about this with my middle brother on the phone the other day. I was like, ideas are free and cheap. Execution is expensive and timely.
Yes.
So that's it.
Yes. And so it's kind of like what's neat, and it's kind of where we can segue into, university and entrepreneurial life, is that there's a clear plan to get into admissions to go to university. So as a student, you could step through these steps, and it's kind of like, where you go through university, you get into entrepreneurship. There's not such clear steps, but there you can create a plan, and you can learn systems and networking and communication, how you put all that together. Yeah. But so, what year did you go to University of Texas?
So I graduated high school 2001, and then I went to UT. So 9/11 happened my second week of school. I vividly remember walking on campus and 9/11 happening. And that was like my first 2 weeks of college. And then, so I went to school 2001 through 2005. And I was actually in the communications school. I graduated I was in public relations, and I did the business foundations program, which is kind of like a minor in business. And UT was great, and college was great for me. But the day that I started, it was not an academic exercise for me. Once I got to college, I was like, I made it to college, and I immediately ditched all academic pursuit. And it wasn't that I was a crappy student. It was that I realized that academia was not for me. Like, I knew that being the straight A kid in college, like I was in high school and middle school, was not my intent. My intent now was, hey, most of the people who I'm in college with have had life experiences that I've never had. They've traveled, they have passports, they've done all these things, and I realized that college was my platform to get those experiences, and that's immediately what I went after doing.
Mm-hmm. And so, from skipping that into what did you do post college?
So through college, I worked, and I worked. I did public relations for the University of Texas Longhorns, so the basketball team, football team, all that. I did the media for them. I interned all over the place. So I interned at Motorola when they spun off Freescale here in Austin. I interned in Dallas for Southwest Airlines and their headquarters there. So when I graduated college, I had like a pretty extensive resume for a college kid, at least, of like having worked in my field. And so I decided that I wanted to move to Washington, D.C. because I was really hungry for like access, and I felt like there was certain kind of access that existed in D.C., especially around politics. And like I said, after going to college in the like immediate post 9/11 age, some people were like called to serve, overseas, and for me, I feel like I was called to find some way to like serve in politics. And so I went to DC, this bright-eyed kid thinking I was going to like change the world through some kind of politic thing, and that didn't work, of course. But but I did go there, and I learned some really important lessons because my first job out of college was I was a speechwriter. And I graduated from college in that summer, August 27th, I believe, Hurricane Katrina hit. And at the time, I was interviewing all over the place in D.C., and including the White House. So I had an interview in the White House to work in the press secretary's office at the White House. And Katrina hit. I got a call from the Office of Personnel Management, which is like the office that controls like where people get jobs and stuff in the administration. And they said, hey, would you be interested in being a speechwriter in the Department of Homeland Security? And I was like, that's interesting, but I think I'd rather work in the White House. Well, I emailed And then, well, later I learned that job was to be the speechwriter for the director of FEMA. And I was like, whoa, that'd be crazy. Like, Katrina just hit, the FEMA's getting so much crap, like, because they're bad response. And so I emailed the press secretary at the White House, and he's like, that would be a substantive job. So basically I say, yes, I'll take this job, because the press secretary at the White House is like, yeah, that would be a good job. So I'm driving from Austin to DC to start my job. And as I'm driving to DC, Michael Brown, the FEMA director, gets fired, or he resigns. And I'm like, wait, I don't even know who my boss is going to be. Well, then they appoint the new director, who was the Florida emergency management leader, this guy, David Paulson, who was great. And I became his speechwriter. So for his first year as the administrator of FEMA, I was his speechwriter. I wrote all his speeches, all his talking points, and it was like getting thrown into a fire, because here it is, like 3 weeks after Katrina, and I'm 22 years old, and I'm writing all the talking points that like are going to Anderson Cooper. And so it was a great experience for me, because I got that access. I mean, I was like, my first day on the job, I was in a presidential briefing. So it was like amazing access, but then I just got burnt out on, and it reminded me that like I wanted to do something more creative, because DC isn't an entrepreneurial experience, Mm-hmm. It's very much like kind of paint by numbers, more or less. And so I got burnt out on that life in DC after 3-4 years, and I moved back to Austin.
So I mean, that's a pretty unique role. And now, I'm not very knowledgeable in the space of speech writing and speaking points. So how did you articulate what was to be communicated, and how were you getting these speaking points? So what was that process like?
Yeah. So back to kind of where my name, or the origins of my name, and the keeper of messages and all that stuff. This is really where I felt this the most. So my job was, in essence, to be rapid response for Katrina and Hurricane Rita, which happened right after Katrina in Houston. So if like CNN was reporting something, or New York Times, and then my job was to deliver communications and talking points that will respond to the questions that they were posing through this journalistic, interviewing and stuff. So what I would do is I would spend 6-7 hours a day in FEMA interviewing the people who were doing this work. So the people who were responding, who were, the actual emergency managers, the people who were in charge of like flood mitigation, the people who were in charge of like, recovering people or recovering assets, all these things. And I'd interview them, and then I would get the information. I would distill it down into, like talking points that the director could then relay into media. So it really was a test in gathering information, and then figuring out how to communicate only the parts of the information that matter. And I always say, like, everyone knows Michael Brown's name. Everyone remembers that name, like George Bush being like, way to go, Brownie, and all that stuff. But no one remembers David Paulison's name, who was the director after him. And I consider that like success. Like, to me, that means he was successful, because I don't think people should know the name of the FEMA director. It's kind of like being the director of like being like in the CIA or something. Like, you do your job if people don't know who you are, mm-hmm. And it's FEMA's the same way. Like, if people know you, it's because you're not doing something right. And so you're having to be on TV to address why something's going wrong. Mm. And so the fact that people didn't know the director after Michael Brown, to me, was success, because it mean that the work spoke for itself. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean they were perfect, but it does mean that they didn't make those huge gaffes that lead to people like calling for you to get fired and resign, all that stuff.
Now, the stresses of doing your job, did you ever feel, what was that like? Did you ever not do what you needed to do to get the right messaging across?
Well, man, the first 2 months was just it was the craziest time, because this is just like immediately, weeks after Katrina and Rita. And so the hierarchy was, there was the director of FEMA, and then he had a chief of staff, and then he had a communications director, who had a deputy communications director. Then there was a press secretary, and then there was me. So in my first week, the chief of staff resigned. The deputy the communications director resigned or was let go or something. The press secretary left. So it meant from like there were 5 levels between me and the director to like I was like 1 or 2 levels removed. And it was like, and here I am, this 22-year-old guy, and like, you know, I thought I was like sharp and all this stuff, but like I had never been in that kind of professional setting. So it really just the moment required of me to kind of act beyond my years in a lot of ways. And I wouldn't say I was 100% successful, but you know, I think that it was a good thing that it was something like 6 months before anyone knew that I was like fresh out of college, you know, because I just was doing so much work, and people just looked at the work product. They didn't look at, you know, oh, this guy's young, he's making these mistakes. So that was really good experience for me to like become an entrepreneur later on, because so much of entrepreneurship is deciding that you're going to do something before you know how to do it. You know, like so much of it is, it's like kind of Richard Branson says, if someone asks you to do something that you don't know how to do, then the only response should be yes. And then on your own, you can figure it out, you know? And and that's kind of what entrepreneurship is. It's like, it's a lot of times you're teaching yourself how to do something so that you can emanate confidence to people who don't know how to do it either. You know, it's really, especially with fundraising and things like that. It's like, you know, like most often than not, you're creating something that didn't exist before. And so you have to be the person that is like, well, I know how to make this thing exist. So you have to believe that I can make this thing exist. And working at FEMA in that moment, like it gave me that kind of like fire tested, you know, experience to let me know that like I could pretty much, I won't sink in any scenario. Like I will always be able to swim, and maybe even be a strong swimmer in all these scenarios.
That's great. And so what happened post that job?
So I went to a political government relations firm for a couple of years. And then what happened is, while I was there, I was just getting really, like I said earlier, I was just getting kind of burnt out on being in an environment where I didn't feel like I was able to create. And so in 2009, right, literally the week after Obama was inaugurated as president, I moved back to Austin, and I was recruited by a former professor of mine at UT. He was starting up a social media consulting agency, and I was his first hire. So I helped him build his business, his first like maybe $1 or $2 million in clients, and then. And it was a very short amount of time I was there too, because I moved back to Austin, and in 8 months, a lot of the clients started trying to hire me and poach me. And then a lot of prospective clients were trying to hire me. And so I decided to strike out on my own. And so my first business that I started as an adult was in 2009, that fall, I got a contract with FedEx to be a social media consultant for them. And it was like triple my salary. The contract, because the head of communications for FedEx, she realized that like social media was something that was becoming very important for big brands, and that someone like me, that was where my age actually was a benefit, right? Because I was a young person, I understood it more than people who had been doing traditional marketing for 10, 20, whatever years. So literally I tripled my salary with this contract, and ended up doing like a consulting for FedEx, for Deep Eddy Vodka, for Bridget Dunlap and her businesses on Lester Pearl. And then while I'm doing social media consulting, I realized, man, I really like all this stuff, but all this stuff is still very like, it wasn't tangible, and I wanted to do something that I could see and touch. And so I was like, well, what am I interested in? And I realized I was really interested in sneakers. I was always in like sneaker culture, from my brothers especially. And so I decided to start a sneaker boutique called Sneak Attack. So in 2009, I opened up a sneaker boutique. It was at City Hall downtown, where now there's an Austin Rocks there. But it was a sneaker boutique with like limited edition sneakers.
Was that conjunction with Paul?
So I opened Sneak Attack, and Paul Carrozza, the founder of Runtex, the owner of Runtex at the time, he had that space at City Hall, and he liked my concept for Sneak Attack. So he, in essence, like donated the space to me, like as an investment of sorts. And so I had that space, and that was my base of operations, but mostly my business was doing pop-up events. So I'd take my inventory and I'd pop up at different events around town. So like Fun Fest, or like concerts at Scoot Inn, hip hop shows and things like that. And a lot of times I'd sell more sneakers in like 3 hours at a concert than 3 days in the brick and mortar.
That whole experience association to your product. And so how long did you run with Sneak Attack?
Man, Sneak Attack only went for a little under a year and a half. And the thing that I did right with Sneak Attack is that it was the thing that I did right with Sneak Attack was really around branding. I really learned branding. Like, I mean, I always had ideas around branding from doing stuff with FedEx and all these brands before, but Sneak Attack was my first chance to really do it from the ground up. I was the person out there like talking about what this meant and why this was here, why this existed, and marketing directly to consumers. The thing that I did wrong, though, was I jumped into an industry that I had no passion for, which is retail. Retail is like, a certain type of person likes retail. Just like a certain type of person maybe likes carpentry and wants to do that. A certain type of person likes, like there's just, it's one of those things where like not just anyone can jump in and own like a brick and mortar retail shop. And that was my least favorite part of the business, is like doing things like inventory controls and management and all that. And so it didn't last as long as it should have, because at the time I was still of that mind of trying to do everything myself. So I didn't find a business partner who liked that stuff, who liked doing that back office kind of accounting, inventory control stuff. And I tried to do it all. And so I didn't learn the lesson until the business had died. And so at that moment, I told myself that I wouldn't start a business unless I had a partner. And so my next two businesses were businesses where I had a partner to kind of cover my gaps and my weaknesses. And it's something that I recommend to anyone. Whenever people come to me with an idea, I'm like, okay, like, what are you good at? And they tell me, and I'm like, okay, like you did not list blank, 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 blank. So until you find someone to do blank, 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 like this idea that you have is not going to get off the ground in the way you want it to.
Mm-hmm. So absolutely, team is everything when I think you're trying to take something, especially if you're trying to do it outside of your own scope.
Yeah.
And the limitations of your own skills.
Yeah.
Well, that's powerful. So where did you bridge? Because I know you've done some things for your South by Southwest fashion. Was that during Sneak Attack, or was that?
Yeah. So I've been very fortunate to, I've always failed forward. Some people, you hear that saying a lot, fail, it's okay to fail if you fail forward, all this stuff. I have failed forward. With Sneak Attack, I failed. I straight up failed. I started a business. It was not sustainable, and it no longer existed. But I failed forward because the things that I did well was around branding and understanding like the fashion industry in a way. And I had a lot of relationships there now. So what I was able to do was go to one of the founders of South by Southwest, who is now passed, Brent Gorky. He was the creative director for South by for years. And I was sitting down with him over lunch, and I said, man, you have tech, you have film, you have music. You should have something around fashion and style, because that seems like that other like creative entity. And this is before there was a South by Echo, South by Sports, all this stuff. And so what I convinced him was, let me build out a business that allows you to start dipping your toe into this industry. And so it took like 9 months of like negotiating and all this stuff, but we figured it out with the right team. I went out and got a partner who had a lot of kind of event production background. I found the right people inside of South by to become like their internal advocates for this idea. And then we created it. So what it was a series. It was a couple of years, 2010, 11, 12. We did a mix of fashion centric panels. So obviously South by loves doing panels. So I curated panels. We did runway shows where we got South by Southwest musicians to wear clothes of these emerging brands and do like these runway shows. And then we had a pop-up experience. So we did retail inside the convention center during South by Southwest Music with dozens of brands that I recruited from around the country, emerging brands. Some of these brands are doing very well today. Like the number one brand that I would say is a company called Bucket Feet. And they do these like kind of like Vans style shoes, like casual sneakers. Very successful company. My guess is they're doing at least $10, $20 million a year in revenue. They have locations in New York, Chicago, DC, a lot of e-com. I mean, and they were this small little company when I found them and was like, you got to come to South by and pop up here. Xanarobe is a men's brand. That was another one. And so what I was able to apply from Sneak Attack was the understanding of like the fashion industry and trends in that way. And then what I was able to try to learn from was like building the team out and covering some bases that I didn't have, or some expertise that I didn't have. So that was a really successful endeavor. I mean, it was cash flow positive from day one. I mean, I think it was like for over a couple of years, maybe a $75,000-$80,000 investment, we returned 4 or 5x that in total revenue.
And what was the revenue stream?
So the brands would have to pay for spots to have the pop-ups, much like during South by Southwest's convention, brands pay for spaces in the convention center. So that was the main revenue stream. And then we had sponsors. So I went out and I sold sponsorships to some of the bigger brands like The Gap or Keds or whatever. And so they would pay for the opportunity to sponsor the event. And so it was a legitimate business, but what I didn't like about it was that it only happened once. So if you didn't come to South by Southwest those 2-3 days, then you missed it. And I didn't like that. I was like, man, like working 365 days a year for 2 or 3 days, that's not what I'm into. And so I started thinking about how can we expand this business, and that's where we were able to go out and we got X Games as a client. And X Games said, is this an approach that you can try to bring to X Games? So we worked with them. We did a kind of a fashion-centric event for them for the Aspen Winter X Games in 2013. And through the mix of doing all this, I realized that I wanted to do a bigger business, like something that had real scale, real tentacles that could touch people beyond like a 2 or 3 day event. And it just worked out where I was getting recruited by a tech company here in town called Bazaar Voice, that at the time was one of the fastest growing tech companies in Austin. And the CEO and the COO, they recruited me for 3-4 months. And I basically ditched my business. I totally exited South by business, X Games, all that stuff, and went to take a job at Bazaar Voice. And I became the director of operations there before their IPO. And with the intent of, now I can get experience here so that I can one day have a tech startup that has real scale, that I don't have to be in front of the person to have them interacting with my product or my business. So it's been this very circuitous, speechwriter to sneaker boutique to South by Southwest and X Games to a tech startup to, so for me it's just direct. I can connect everything, but for someone else they may not be to see all the connection points.
Yeah, I think it's quintessential, of our time and age of progressing through workspace and experiences that is now becoming the norm versus a 40-year tenure at a company.
Yep.
And so I think that it's really what is happening today. And then for you to understand and accept that is unique because it allows you to be versatile and you can pivot and move and transition to what it is you want to do. So your stint there in creating the brand and launching as an IPO, what was your day-to-day and what were you managing people? How, because it sounds like a pretty big package to jump into.
Yeah, it was.
And that was 2 years that you were with them?
I was there a year and a half.
Year and a half.
And so I joined Bazaar Voice April of 2011. And they IPO'd March of 2012. So I was there about a year before the IPO, and in essence created my job. So we created my job description, my boss and I. My boss was the COO. She's basically the number 2 person there. And I took that job really because I wanted to cover some gaps that I didn't have from a skill standpoint. And then also because Heather, who was the CEO, my boss, she was just someone who I knew I could learn from. And she's even been my mentor to this day. She's now the CEO of a company called WP Engine, which is one of the fastest growing tech companies in Austin now. And she just was someone who I felt like I could learn by working for her. And after being an entrepreneur for several years and kind of being my own boss, I feel like I realized that there were a lot of things that I didn't know. And I wanted to find a business that I was willing to do for 5, 7, maybe even 10 years. And before I took that step, I wanted to go and get some skills and some relationships that would help me do that. And Heather was one of those people that I thought would allow me to do that. And so my day-to-day was pretty much to cover operational gaps that she saw. So everything from, hey, the HR department could use some support with recruiting engineers and product managers. We have a really big target on the product team. We need to hire 30 new engineers this quarter, and the HR team their experience is only being able to hire maybe a dozen in a quarter. So we need you to come in and augment their process to help them figure out how to do that. So I did that. Or, hey, we're thinking about opening up a new office in New York. Can you do that? So I would help figure out the plan for opening the New York office. To, hey, we're coming out with a new product and we need to train all of our sales team and a client services team on how to sell this new product to their clients or their prospects. So my day to day was like, I was kind of like a medical residency program where like every month or two you're switching to a new part of the hospital.
So how did you have the skills to do those things? Because some of those seem like they might have been out of pocket for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was all out of pocket for me. I had never done any of that stuff. But what gave me the wherewithal to do that, and the reason why the CEO of a company like Bizarre Voice recruits me to do that, is because when you're an entrepreneur, the great thing is your skill set doesn't get locked in a box. When you're an entrepreneur, what that says is, I am a professional problem solver. I am in the business of solving problems. And so no matter what direction I went into internally at Bizarre Voice, it wasn't because I'd done it before, because there were like subject matter experts in that company who could run circles around me in terms of knowledge of an area. But what I had was a problem solving mentality of like, hey, here's a problem and let's attack this problem. Here's a creative approach to attacking this problem that maybe you haven't thought of, because sometimes when you're a subject matter expert, you tend to see things very like, very myopically. And it's like, you're always looking at things the one way. So that's what I did. I was a kind of an internal problem solver, and it was interesting because I didn't manage people, but I had a hand in managing processes, and I had to find internal partners who could manage the people to make things happen. So it was this interesting position to be in. And so then after the IPO, I ended up being asked to help come up with a way to solve problems for new industries. So that's where I got into travel. They asked me to run the marketing strategy for the travel industry. Like, how can we go after big companies in the travel industry, like big hotels or big online travel sites, and make them Bizarre Voice clients? So I came up with the strategy to do that. And that's when I started really getting interested in like, man, I really love to travel. This is an industry that I think there are a lot of weaknesses. There are a lot of gaps in this industry, and I think that I can solve them. And it got to a point where I was like, I can try to solve them as an employee of Bizarre Voice, or I can try to solve them on my own with my own company. And that's when I decided to leave after a year and a half. It was like, the IPO had happened. I cashed out my stock, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna do this, because I feel like I've learned enough in this year and a half about the tech industry and the gaps in the travel industry, and I want to go after that.
Nice. Good. So now we can transition really into, I guess, the last, 4 years, 3.5 years?
4 years.
4 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I left Bizarre Voice Labor Day of 2012. So it was literally like my last day, I think, was like August 31st or something like that. And then I cashed out, and I lived for, 5 months, like just self-financing myself to work with my co-founder, Chase. We were just kind of talking about what Localer could be. And because it was originally his idea. So he was the one who brought it to me as like, hey, like, wouldn't it be cool if there was a way where people knew where the locals went? And I was like, well, when I've traveled, that's exactly what I do. I was just finding out, I don't go to the concierge of the hotel. I asked like the bellhop or something who I think is like more like me. And so we just started talking about it. And I was a little bit further along professionally than Chase, my co-founder, was. And so it kind of we talked about it briefly, and decided that I was going to be the CEO. And primarily because I was going to be the one going out and fundraising and raising all the money. And so I started out by having us come out with a business plan. So we came up with a business plan, go-to-market strategy really is what we did. We thought about what should this product be? How should we get it out there? And we did that for about 2 months. And then I made a list of 12 friends. And these are all people that I knew from previous walks of life. So former bosses, people that I worked with at South by, people that I knew from Sneak Attack, people that I knew from University of Texas. And I wrote them 12 names down, and I made phone calls or in-person meetings with all the 12 of them, pitching them on Localer. And all Localer at the time had was, it wasn't, the name of the company wasn't even Localer. But all it was like a 10 slide deck, and 8 of those 12 people invested, largely off of me. They believe, like, you know what, Joe is a problem solver. He's done things in the past that have done well. You know, he's really good at marketing and getting awareness for this. I think this can do something well. And 8 of those people invested. So that was the first, 120,000 or so we raised. And then we built the site in 2 months, and then it's been off to the races since South by of 2013. So South by Southwest has always had this interesting role in my professional life because I worked with South by, but then also I launched my startup at South by. And even to this day, South by is a time when I still like meet with a lot of investors, meet with a lot of media. So it's still, even though I think it's South by a little bit is on the decline to a degree, it still has a lot of value. I think if you're an entrepreneur, especially in tech, just because there's a lot of relationships and opportunities that you can make during that one short period of time in Austin that you couldn't otherwise do.
That's an interesting statement. That'll be the title. No, I'm playing. So tell me why is your view, and we won't get too sidetracked by this, but why do you say it's in decline?
So I think South by Southwest is, the reason why I say it's in decline is because the brand of Austin has started to outgrow South by Southwest. South by Southwest was growing because South by Southwest was the tip of the spear for what Austin was known as. It was like South by Southwest was branding Austin as a center for tech or for film or for music. And now Austin doesn't really need it as much, right? Austin has a tech scene. We've had Bazaar Voice, we've had HomeAway, we have Whole Foods, we have big companies. Austin has a film industry, has Richard Linklater, it has Robert Rodriguez. A lot of movies and TV shows get filmed here. It has this music scene, obviously, that has outgrown. Even Austin City Limits TV show now has this big festival. So I think that the reason why it's in decline is because as Austin is maturing as a city, it's becoming less oriented around one big event each year and more about like a 365-day experience. So it's not, I don't think it's in a decline in a hurry, like on a scale of 1 to 10, if I think South by, I would say it peaked. My guess is I would say somewhere between 2011 and so maybe 2010 to 12, somewhere in there. And I'd say some of the things that helped it hurt it. So like when Twitter blew up during South by and did really well, and Foursquare then like the next year, that helped South by's brand around tech and innovation. But I think what it hurt is that it expedited that rapid shift away from the focus on music and emerging musicians. And now like the most focus of South by is like what new apps are getting launched, which is helpful for me. And even as a tech entrepreneur, it's funny me saying that I think it hurt South by, but I do think it did because now people are like focused on like, is Jay-Z and Kanye playing South by Southwest? Is Mark Zuckerberg or Obama speaking at South by Southwest? And it's not about like, is there an emerging startup that's coming out, or is there an emerging musician? And
kind of flipped.
Yeah, and Austin's done that too, right? Austin was a city where 10, 15 years ago, it was about like that up and comer. And now Austin's kind of being measured more about the big companies. It's like more about the Whole Foods of the world and less about like the Epic bars. I mean, I'm not saying that Epic bars not doing well here because they are. And having a Whole Foods here helps them. But at the same time,
it makes sense. The point that you're making is totally makes sense, and I think that's the evaluation of the time and day and age that we're in. But we sidetracked. Let's bring you back to Local Lore and talk about that. I mean, 4 years in the startup space and bringing on investors and your angel investors is a whole different space of entrepreneurship. And so with that journey, what has been the essence of that journey for you?
Yeah, so there are like, I would say 4 distinct phases that we've been in. We're in the 4th right now. The first 3, so that first phase was a reason to believe. So when I say that, I mean taking an idea and making it real and giving someone a reason to believe that like you can execute on the idea. So that was that first phase. That was the first few months of building the idea, the go-to-market strategy, raising the first little money, and then getting it out there. And we got like 5,000 users in the first 2 weeks of South by, or the first 10 days of South by, when we launched. And so that was that first phase. And that's when you're just like, every little milestone is like, you're excited. You're just like, every press hit, every little mention, everything, you feel like it's like, oh, that's awesome. That's the thing. And then the naivety dies off a little bit once you're like, a few months or even a few years in, and that phase it dies out.
Yeah.
And then the second phase you in is the what is the what phase, I would say. And now it's like, now you're in that phase of like, okay, we did have a great South by, but now what? Right? Like, what's that next level of like, how do we get this to break from like, oh, it had a good launch to like, it's here to stay. And that's like a longer phase that is like, for us, I would say that phase lasted for 2 years or a year and a half of like, just constantly like putting your heads down and just like constantly having to do little things to validate that this thing was here to stay. And then that was a phase where it was like, continuous fundraising, continuous grind, launching new cities, getting new localers, getting more users, and just like a lot of the work behind the scenes that wasn't, it was like searching for a silver spoon in a lot of ways to get this like rapid hockey stick growth, but at the same time doing the little things to make sure that you don't just like fall on your back. And then we found that iota of a breakthrough, and that was the third phase we entered, which is we were able to secure an investment from 3 former Facebook executives. It was a major investment, and with those funds, we were able to hire our first like real tranche of employees. We hired a couple of engineers because at that point it was just freelancers we were working with. And then we really came up with a strategy for how to grow quickly. And in 2015, we grew more in like 6 months of 2015 than we did in our previous 2 years. It was like, cause we figured out we really dialed into like what's working, and we did a lot of that. But then we entered what I would say is the fourth phase, which is, this is that period that we're entering, which is, okay, now you have to turn this into like a business. And so that's the tough thing about tech startups in particular. It's different than like if you have a retail shop or like a gym or something where like revenue is like a day one approach. In tech startups, a lot of times revenue is like you're focused on user growth first. And so we focused on user growth, and we hit some important user growth milestones, but it didn't trigger the type of venture capital interest that we expected. And so we went through this phase where we realized we really like struggled in a way to get that interest from venture capitalists that we thought was there, because there were like macro dynamics in the venture capital industry that were changing underneath us and above us. So then we entered the phase we're in now, which is making it a viable business so that you don't need to continue fundraising. So that's where the phase we're in now. So in the last several months, we've announced some great partnerships that are paving the way for us to generate real revenue. So if you download Localer's app today or go on our website, there's a hotel section, and people are able to then book hotels, and we get a commission from the hotels. That's the first time we've ever done that. That just launched a month ago. We have a national partnership with JetBlue Airways. Mm-hmm. And so JetBlue actually, they in essence compensate us to have access to some of our content, to share our content to their travelers through things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. So we're starting to build a pathway to monetizing in a way where it becomes a sustainable business that doesn't require us to constantly be banging our heads against the next fundraising milestone. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we are right now. And it's an interesting phase because, not all entrepreneurs are meant for all phases of the business. My co-founder Chase, he left Localer 2 months ago, and it was, he and I are just I think we are rare in that we are very open, honest co-founders. A lot of times I hear a lot from friends of mine who have like co-founder fighting and stuff. And Chase and I, we had arguments, we had fights, but nothing catastrophic. Like, it was always in the spirit of like honesty and openness and trying to push the business forward. And the same thing happened earlier this summer. I realized that I wanted to get closer to the product decisions, and Chase's job was basically running the product. And I realized that that in essence, like we couldn't have like a two-headed product monster, right? Like it needed to be, one of us needed to really run the product. And so he and I just had a very honest conversation for several weeks. And we decided that, I would take over the product and he would exit the business. And he's still he owns the most of Localer besides me still to this day. So he's still like a shareholder and all this stuff. But I think it was a natural evolution of like the stage of business that we're in. And Chase is very much the person who has amazing ideas and gets them off the ground, puts the team together, gets them off the ground, executes on the idea, shares his vision with the world. And I thought that I was the same way, but now the more that I do Localer, the more I realize that I'm actually not the person that takes something from 0 to 40. I used to think that. I used to tell people, I'm the person that takes it from 0 to 40. Someone else can help me get it like from like 40 to 100. I realized like I'm actually the person that takes something from like 20 to 60. So even with Localer, like I think Localer's at 40 right now, and I want to get it to 60. I think 60 is where I hand it off. Like I can see that horizon where maybe I'm the chairman of the board and I bring in someone who I think is very well equipped with the kind of operational skills to really be the CEO and president or something of like a well-oiled machine and make that thing go and become a very like massive business. But for me, it's like 60 miles an hour for me is like Localer expanding to maybe 20 international cities and generating $1 to $5 million in annual revenue. But someone taking it from 60 to 100 is the person who's like, I'll take your $5 million a year business and turn it into a $100 million a year business. And that's like, I don't know if that's me right now.
So we haven't specifically said what Local Lore is.
Yeah.
So tell us for the listeners to know how to access the app and the website and how to engage it and use it. Yeah.
So it's called Localer, local EUR, like a connoisseur of local. And the idea came about because we realize that the way that a lot of us travel is not to find the tourist attractions or the tourist destinations to go to, but to find out, land somewhere new and figure out like, if I lived here, where would I go? Where would I eat? Where would I sleep? Where would I drink? Where do the locals go? And so we felt like Yelp and TripAdvisor really didn't share that information because so much of their reviews are from tourists themselves who don't know the local scene. And so we built this platform where we would require and validate that people were local. So we verify that you're a local. You have to live in the city. We're in 30 cities now. And you share recommendations, not reviews, not critical reviews, but positive recommendations on your favorite places to eat, drink, work out, shop, hang out, whatever. So we have we have 10,000 places nationwide. The 10,000 of the best places, local businesses, places to go in 30 cities. We've had 1.3 million users who have benefited from this, and when we're growing every day. I mean, we launched 10 new cities in the last 4 months. So my hope is that by the end of next South by, I want to be in 50 cities.
So what are your most prominent cities that you would say,
Austin was number one for the longest, for like a year and a half, 2 years. And then population trends just start, or not trends, but Austin's not as big of a city as LA, New York, Houston. So now our biggest cities by usage are New York, LA, Houston, Miami, Atlanta, DC, Chicago. Austin's up there, but it's not in the top 3. So and the great thing about Localer is, I said we're in 30 cities. None of our cities are more than 10% of our users. So even our number one city, Houston's like 9% of our users. So every city has like good distribution of usage. And what that tells me is that we're not trying to reach critical mass in one city. We're trying to reach critical mass nationally, where we go from like, hey, maybe only, if there are 1 million millennials in Houston or New York, maybe right now 10,000 or 50,000 of them are using Localer. And critical mass is maybe where about 100,000 or 150,000 are using Localer. And that's what I see happening in the next 6 to 9 months.
So what do you think will be that tipping point that will get the users to increase? Because I think that y'all have a phenomenal product.
Yeah.
And where's awareness tip?
What's interesting? I've been thinking about this a lot, especially the last year, because we're in this fourth phase. I've realized that the kind of business that we're building won't have a tipping point. what it'll have is inevitability. So a great example is Vice. A lot of people know about Vice, right? When people think Vice today, they think about TV. Like Vice has his TV channel, TV shows. That's the last 3 years of Vice. Vice is like a 22-year-old business. For its first 19 years or 15 years, it was not doing TV. And what happened with Vice is they spent their first 6 to 10 years really focusing on doing one niche thing well, which was they had a magazine, really good, authentic, quality content that specifically millennial type people were interested in, people who were adventurous, etc. And what happened is the market caught up to them. And once it caught up, then they became attractive. They had built a business. They became attractive to venture capital firms. They were able to go out and raise tens, hundreds of millions of dollars from investors as a 10, 12, 15-year-old business. And now they're this massive, $4 billion media enterprise. Localer is on that same track where I've realized that we aren't going to have that one moment where like we get the right tweet and then all of a sudden we have millions and millions of users. We're going to just keep becoming a better product every single day, better content, more reach, better usage, better partners every single day. And then slowly but surely the market's catching up to us. And we're seeing this. I mean, Airbnb, Google, Priceline, TripAdvisor, all these companies are now coming out with these products that say like, we're about local experiences or we have local guides. They're all doing something since 2016 that we've been doing since 2013. That's why, frankly, a lot of these companies are like trying to come at us today about like trying to acquire us or partner with us. So we're in an enviable position in a lot of ways because we have a lot of muscle memory around how to do something that all of the bigger companies are trying to do now. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they have more resources. So in one hand, you could argue that they'll get there quicker than us. But on the other hand, I would argue that because of the focus that we've had on trust and authenticity and the quality of the content, that you can't build Vice overnight, right? Like any company could have tried, HBO could have tried to build Vice in 2 years, but guess what? They would not have built Vice, right? Because Vice had 5, 10, 15 years of experience building out the type of content and point of view that they had. That was their competitive difference. And that's kind of where Localer is right now. Like no one's ever going to confuse Localer with TripAdvisor or Localer with Yelp, because our focus on authenticity and quality is just so much higher. You see it the second you open the app, it's like it just looks better. It feels better. It feels more authentic.
That's good. Well, switching gears and talking into some experiences for you, one question we like to ask is, what was one of your biggest struggles or challenges as an entrepreneur, or life in general, that you overcome and.
Yeah, I think that the most difficult thing that I've experienced in business is quite frankly, it's getting the benefit of the doubt. And what I mean by that, especially me being a black founder CEO in tech is like, I think the statistics show that most tech is like 2% African American. So Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, these companies, 2% or less of their employees are black. So there's a gap between the belief that like someone like me can be successful in this industry and the resources that we're able to have to be successful. So one of the big hurdles has been being able to go out and raise venture capital or raise the funds necessary to be successful, because there's not a lot of experience with like out of all of the Austin venture capital firms, of which there are 3 or 4, there's only one that has invested in a black founder. So like, right? It's like there's a little bit of a gap between what they're used to seeing and then how the process they're used to doing and it's the same with women. Women have a lot of issues in tech with being able to go out and raise funds or get the promotions, get the roles that men get. So that's been a big hurdle. And I would say very much in line with what I was saying earlier about that book, The Obstacle is the Way. What I've started to realize is this perceived weakness, I can actually make that a strength. So what I've realized is there are a lot of companies that they have a clear weakness in diversity. They have a clear weakness in understanding audiences that they're not members of. Case in point, Airbnb right now, the single biggest issue that Airbnb is facing, and the CEO himself has said this, is that they're getting a lot of discrimination cases. So Black Airbnb users have said publicly numerous times in the past year that they are not getting accepted for bookings of apartments because the user on the other end finds out that they're Black and is like, I don't want you to stay in my place. And so the CEO has hired, they just hired Eric Holder, who is the Attorney General for Obama, to come up with a policy to change Airbnb's policy to make it anti-discriminatory, right? So that's not an issue that local is going to have, right? Like, no one's going to look at us and say they don't understand how to deliver content to African-American travelers because the founder is an African-American traveler, right? So I've realized that there are some strengths that we have because of the very weaknesses that we also have. So I've been trying to visualize turning this weakness and this perceived weakness into a strength, and so far it's been paying off. Like, there's specific types of press that we can get. Like when our JetBlue deal, we announced that deal through an article in Black Enterprise, which is like, a Black business focus, kind of like Fortune or Inc., but focused on Black owned businesses. And that wouldn't happen for a startup that doesn't have a Black CEO and founder. So I've realized that there are some benefits that come with this hurdle as well.
That's great. That's a good way to look at it. And what was the name of that book again?
The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Next question for you is influential books, movies, or podcasts, things that have impacted you in a certain way. One of those, or
yeah. Well, I mentioned a book, Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way. I also there are a lot of good like business books and all that stuff. But what I like reading isn't so much business books, but books that really train you on how to think about yourself in a tough situation. So there's this World War II survivor named Viktor Franz, and he always he was like I'm trying to remember if he was some type of academic, and his goal in life was to write some definitive like academic research type book. And he was Jewish. He got put in a concentration camp, and he survived the concentration camp, and he ended up writing this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And I read this book. Read this book probably 4 times already now. It's a small little book. Great novel though. I mean, not a novel, but like probably 100 pages. Just really like lifeisms type thing, I'd say. And through this terrible experience of being in a concentration camp, he ended up reaching his goal. He lived the experience that allowed him to write the definitive literary work of his life. It wasn't an academic book. It wasn't something that he wrote for his dissertation. It was something that he experienced. And that's the gap that a lot of academics have, is that they want to write, but it's usually rooted in academia instead of life experience. There's another book that I recently read by a guy named Paul Calatani, and he was a neurosurgeon, cancer. He was a brain surgeon. He got cancer, and he always wanted to be a writer, but he decided to pursue the path of medicine instead. And when he was told he only had 6 months to live, or a year to live or something, he basically poured himself into writing this book about his experience with like becoming a doctor and then getting cancer, which is the very thing he was treating. So I like this idea that sometimes, when you think that your intent is to do one thing, what you through the process of trying to do that thing, something's happened. The very obstacles that you have to face, whether it's cancer or being in a concentration camp or being a Black CEO and founder and trying to get venture capital funds, like you may end up with the very story that's going to allow you to have the most impact. So I think about that now. Like I definitely have a book in me now about my experience as a Black CEO founder in tech. And I realized no one's written that book before, which is incredible. So Like I'm already thinking like, when Localer's done and, I find the new CEO for Localer to take us to $100 million in revenue, one of the things I want to do is write like a book sharing my story and my experiences to help the next set of, female or minority founders trying to do the same thing that I'm doing. So those are, reading is a big thing that I do. Movies. I like same thing with movies. I like those movies like Rudy and whatever, like these movies about someone working really hard and like overcoming obstacles. Because that's just my life experience, like no one would have said, if someone met me when I was 8 years old or, they looked at my family like, hey, my mom had my brother when she was a high school senior or 18 years old. My grandmother had my mom when she was 17, like, no one's gone to graduate from college. We're on food stamps. No one would look at me and say, here's this kid who's going to become a successful CEO someday, and here I am 25 years later. And certain people say that. So I feel like, I really relate to those stories of like underdogs.
Gotcha. And then taking that to, our third question about, some of the best advice you've received, over your life.
Well, I think that there's like two specific things. One is, I don't know if I ever received this advice, but I very, very, very much take it to heart. If you want to start a business, you have to be willing to take a job. And a lot of people come to me and they say like, how did you start this business and how did you do? You know how I started a tech startup? I started a tech startup because I went and worked for a tech startup. And if I did not go and take that job at Bizarre Voice, if I was like too proud and was like, nope, I'm used to being my own boss. I've been doing this stuff with South by Southwest. It's successful. I'm consulting. I'm doing well. Then I never would have had the network, the know-how, all this stuff, to the industry knowledge to become a tech founder. And so one thing I would just highly recommend to people is you be willing to work for someone, because being willing to work for someone and be on someone else's team when they're trying to achieve their goal is going to teach you things about how you can get other people to want to be on your team to help you reach your goal. So that's one piece of advice that I don't know if I've received that outright, but I've learned that over time through my own experiences. And then the second piece is, and this is something that Heather, who was my boss at Bizarre Voice, and she's on my board. She's my first board member. This is something that it's advice that I've learned from her by looking at her more than her telling me this outright. Tact is a very powerful thing. A lot of times entrepreneurs, we tend to be very hard-headed, very stubborn. We sometimes are, we don't have the patience for people who don't understand our vision or see our vision. If you go and you talk to someone about your vision and they don't have the same excitement as you, then you're like, oh, well, never mind, forget them. And what I've learned from Heather is that if you have the tact, then you'll learn that if someone's willing to sit down with you and they tell you, 2, 3, 4, whatever reasons why maybe your idea isn't quite there yet, what they're telling you, they're literally laying out the obstacles. They're helping you. Sometimes the people that are like, oh, everything you just said is amazing, those people aren't the people who are equipped to help you. Sometimes those are the people who aren't going to push you to get over those obstacles. So I think that it's really important to constantly be seeking out people who aren't going to tell you just what you want to hear, but tell you the things maybe that you're not willing to hear. I just had one of these kind of what I would say fierce conversations with one of my board members about this very thing. And then, like I said earlier, there was a point when I was scared to talk to one or two of my investors because there was like some, it was like tense conversations. And I realized like they're telling me things that I actually need to hear sometimes. So I would just say like, take it to heart that, some people are just, you don't need to pay attention to their advice because some people just do like to hear themselves talk when they're giving you quote unquote advice. But some people, really truly are invested in you, invest in what you're trying to accomplish. and they're trying to lay out to you the obstacles that they're going to see you having to jump to be successful. And I would say I've probably wasted, I wouldn't say wasted because I've learned from it, but I would say 30% of my time as an entrepreneur has been learning things that I thought that I already knew that I had to learn the hard way. And that 30% is now what I'm spending 30% extra time to make up for. And so every day I get better, so maybe there was probably a point in my life where it would have been 50% or even 70% was being spent doing stuff that I didn't have to, but now it's like today I'm probably only spending 10 to 20% of my time at most doing something that I shouldn't be doing, that I'm later going to have to spend 10, 20% time doing to fix. So like every day I just try to get a little bit better. Hopefully one day I'll be at like 99% or like 99% of my time is spent doing the right thing. It's never going to be 100%.
Always getting better.
Yeah.
So any advice, life lessons advice that you would give? I know you kind of intertwined some advice in there with what you had gotten, but some life lessons that you've learned over the years,
Yeah. So not growing up with my dad was like fundamentally you asked the question of obstacles I've overcome, and like a lot of people didn't grow up with their dads or their moms or their parents. I get it. So it's not like I'm special, woe is me or whatever. But what I had to realize as I've gotten older is everyone has their own battles. Everyone has their own chip on their shoulder about their own things. So even someone who maybe they did grow up with both of their parents, and maybe both of their parents were very well off, and their dad is a lawyer and their mom's a doctor and they're just doing well, but it doesn't mean that for them their life is easy. Maybe it makes their life in your eyes easier than your life if you had a different experience, but it doesn't make, in their eyes, what I've realized is everyone is living the worst, hardest version of their life. It doesn't mean everyone's not having fun and happy and all this stuff, but everyone in their own eyes, they've experienced all the hardships that they can handle for them. And it's true. And so a lot of times I think that it's important to realize that everyone comes into every meeting, every interaction, bringing their own hardships, whatever that is. Maybe the person who their dad was a lawyer, their mom's a doctor, maybe their hardship was like living up to their parents' standards, which is different than me because our standards were lower. Just going to college was like a big deal in my family. Whereas for someone else, if their parents have like PhDs, maybe like getting a bachelor's degree is not enough for them. So I think that it's really important to know that people come in with their own hardships. Because when you think about that, it helps you get to know people through the lens of like, what is success for them and where are they trying to go? So when you're building a team, you want to know like, how can them helping you help you be successful? But more importantly, how can them helping you help them uncover their own thing? So like my lead engineer, he's phenomenal, super smart. And he could be making more money. He knows this. He can make more money. He could probably have a better, fancier title or whatever working somewhere else. But I realized that what I love about him, what I value in him is that he is really passionate about the quality of work he's doing. He really wants to know what he's capable of as an engineer. He knows that maybe 3 or 5 years in his career from now, he'll maybe have different focuses. Maybe he'll have kids and he'll be wanting to have a higher paying job and, bigger house or whatever. But right now, I think he really acknowledges that he really wants to be able to say, look, this is what I did. So the more that he can prove about himself as a capable engineer, then the better. And if that thing is tied to a mission that he believes in fundamentally, then even better. And that's where he is with Localer. And I really respect that in him. And I think that he knows what I care about with Localer. So I think it's just really when you're building a team, you have to learn that everyone's coming in with their own hardships, their own expectations, and their own goals. And if the more you can learn those insights from people, then the better you're going to be in terms of team building, people management, all these things.
That's good. That's life lessons right there. Well, I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, I appreciate you for having me. This has been cool.
I love your excitement and your enthusiasm for everything you've done so far. I mean, where can they go? So is it localeur.com?
Yeah, Localer. So again, LOCALEUR, like a connoisseur of local. We're on the App Store. We're on Android, a website. It's a free app. You don't have to log in through anything. You can download it today and start using it. We're in 30 cities in the U.S., and by next year, we'll be expanding out of the U.S.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Cool. All right.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Amplify Podcast. You can find more at theamplifypodcast.com. Our social links to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Join us in conversation. Let us know what you're thinking and how we can best service you guys. We will see you again really soon.